Capita envisions a future in which families and communities can flourish. By prioritizing families and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to craft effective policies for a future in which families and their communities can flourish. In this episode, Joe Waters and U.S. Representative Becca Balint speak about the crisis of loneliness and disconnection in America. They discuss the lack of social support for parents of young children, the impact of economic inequality on social cohesion, and the role of social media in exacerbating loneliness. They also explore potential solutions, such as investing in physical infrastructure to create spaces for social interaction and enacting policies that support families and communities. Representative Balint emphasizes the importance of diagnosing the problem and working together across the political spectrum to find solutions.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're talking on January 22nd, 2 days after President Trump's second inauguration. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, I'd just love your thoughts and reflections on what we've seen this week.
I have been thinking so much about how it is that we weave the country back together. And it has been, I think, really disappointing to me, reflecting on some of the themes that President Trump touched on in the inauguration. I was really hoping to hear more of, we're in this together. We are all Americans. We need to be looking out for each other. We need to be finding ways to bring us together in common cause. And I didn't hear that. And that worries me because I do care so deeply about the crisis of loneliness and disconnection. I know it plays out on social media. It plays out in our distrust of government, which I think is unfortunately a very dangerous thing. If you don't believe that the structures are there to support you, and if you don't believe that the law is going to be there or the Constitution is going to be there, that I think creates much more of a feeling of anxiety and worry. And I was really hoping to hear more of a coming together message. So that is going to continue to be my message. I know that being from rural areas, Vermont is overwhelmingly rural, and I have voters across the political spectrum. I am a Democrat, but I have certainly a lot of Republicans, independents, and people who just rarely vote, right? People who really want me to show up on the bread and butter issues. So it runs the gamut. And so I have to continue to say to them, you are all important to me. You are all important to your communities, and that we need you as part of the solution to this crisis that people are feeling, disconnection. And so I hope we will see other more positive messages. I'm not feeling hopeful about that. So I feel like I need to continue to show up and say that.
So you proposed the Combating Loneliness Act to address this loneliness epidemic, this crisis of connection. Why was that important to you? And maybe even more important, why was that important to your constituents in Vermont? What have you been hearing from them that led you to this?
Yeah, so many things. So certainly, let me back up if I could, because I think what I learned, I was a teacher for many years. Okay, I taught middle school in 4 different rural public schools in Vermont. And so I know that when people don't feel tied to their community, if they don't feel tied to something larger than themselves, it also drives this sense of disconnection and loneliness. So I have seen this throughout my career as a teacher and then as a state legislator and now as a member of Congress, that the increase in the level of a regular day-to-day anxiety and worry that people are feeling, I know is increasing because people are so much more willing to tell me it, right? It's just like so much more top of mind. And I also made a commitment to myself when I was in a position of leadership in Vermont. So I was a majority leader and then the first woman to lead the Vermont Senate. I started being much more open about my own struggles with anxiety and depression. And a lot of people told me that was political suicide. Like, what are you doing? Stop talking about that. People aren't going to trust you. And I was like, actually, I think the exact opposite is going to happen. I think people are going to see me as a trusted partner in this work. And that is what's happened. I will be at the post office or down at the supermarket or at a town meeting, and people will say, thank you for saying so candidly what your own struggles are, because they would say, my husband struggles with this, or my daughter is struggling, or I'm struggling with. I had this powerful moment at a business forum that I was speaking at in Vermont a few months ago. And it was full of business leaders from across Vermont. And I had made a decision in this speech. We're talking about the crisis of loneliness. We're talking about disconnection. It does impact employers and employees. And so I just put it out there. I didn't know what I would get back. I didn't know if I would see people just closing off. But what happened was a CEO of one of our big employers stood up and he said, I didn't vote for you. I'm not a Democrat. I didn't know what I would hear from you today. But I'm telling you, I am going to vote for you now because you just named the biggest issue in my company, in my leadership. The crisis of loneliness and anxiety and depression is having a real impact on my employees. He said, but it's also impacting me personally. And then he came up to me at the end. He said, thank you for taking time. And so these stories of people struggling in real time and looking for connection, I felt like it's an opportunity for me to use this platform more broadly, because trying to pass bills, right? Trying to pass laws that make life better for people. And when I'm not able to move bills, if I'm not able to get it through, I can still use that position of influence to give a permission structure to people to talk about these things. And so I have heard it from all different walks of life. And that indicates to me, I got to do it more and more. I'm on the right path. And so I really charged my team when I was coming in to think creatively about how we tackle this, because there are lots of different levers that you can move. And we wanted to really build on the work of Robert Putnam. People may know his work, Bowling Alone. He has a new book out. I think it's called Together. And he talks about how we have lost a lot of those community ties and connections, whether it's clubs, whether it's interactions, opportunities to meet people and have meaningful connections. We've lost those over time. And he makes a connection between that and economic disparity and also, some of the ills we see in society. But so we thought, well, so what can we do to help create these places that may make it easier for people to connect? And so I know in Vermont, and it's probably true in West Virginia, people have real strong ties in their communities. And so to build on that, creating spaces for people to come together was really important to us.
Absolutely. And we would say, our senior fellow Ian Corbin has written about this. It's not just the connections and the opportunities to meet, but it's the shared agency. It's the shared ownership. It's the doing of things together, right? That brings us together. It's not just that we meet, but it's the doing. And that has been lost, I think, in a lot of ways, because we have an economy where people feel increasingly distant or increasingly powerless, right?
Yes.
We've all had the experience of being on hold for 3 hours to try and file an insurance claim or something like that. So I'm just curious if you would reflect on the sort of economic dimensions of this, the sense of ownership that people seem to be lacking in society and in the economy, and this broader crisis of connection and loneliness.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel on their own. And, I talked about this some with my dad probably a year ago. And, I just reflected back to him, you have a pension. You put in your time at your company for several decades and you did good work and you deserve a pension to live on. But I said, so many American workers don't have that. They don't have a safety net. They've worked and worked and worked, and they still feel on their own, right? When you have a pension, you don't entirely feel on your own. You feel like there is this support system there to help you to retire with. I love that you use agency, because I think about that a lot. When people don't feel like they have control or agency, I think it is feeding that disconnection. And so, yes, so when you think about the ways in which American workers have lost those safety nets, we have seen also the erosion of unions over time, right? When people felt part of something larger than at the workplace, that they felt like, oh, I wasn't on my own with my employer. Like, we are collectively making sure that we're being paid a decent wage. And I think it connects to health insurance as well. that, we can argue about what a better health insurance system should be. But I think most folks would agree that when people don't feel like they have the ability to take care of themselves and their families on a cellular level, that has an eroding effect on your sense of place and connection. And so it is, by every metric, we have left behind most working people in this country in terms of wage increases, benefits increases. Their wages have been flat for a very long time when you adjust for inflation. And of course it has an impact on your psyche. Just talk to anyone in your circle who has recently lost a job, what that does for people. Work gives us all a sense of purpose. And when you feel like you're not being paid in a way or compensated in a way that is reflective of how you see yourself, that has a deep impact, I think. Do you agree?
Absolutely. We totally agree. But I think you're absolutely right. And of course that leads to the sense of political disaffection that so many Americans feel.
Yes. And that, if I could, I went back to look at some of the data and the charts from the survey that you did with Harvard.
Right.
And one of the things that I found, and I wanted to ask you about this, I have always thought that the crisis of loneliness was worse among the oldest of Americans. So looking at loneliness rates by age, looking at the 30 to 44 age group and seeing it at 26%, and the over 65 at about 10%, I was surprised by that. And I think it makes sense when you also look at what we've been talking about in terms of who's in the workforce, who is like feeling that sense of economic despair, and who are the people using a lot of social media. That was the other one that was really shocking. It was an incredible amount of people that said, we know that is contributing to our sense of loneliness. Like, we know it, and yet we keep doing it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a question I definitely want to ask you about, right? Because I mean, this seems like an area where Congress could take action to, in a sense, reclaim our attention, right? I think it's Ezra Klein saying attention is like the number one sort of commodity right now that is captured, and we need to somehow figure out how we reclaim our attention. And we've heard some members of Congress say, for example, even forcing the social media companies to publish the algorithm so we know, right, how they're capturing attention and we can fight back might be a simple first step. But I just love your thoughts, right? What can Congress do to help us reclaim our attention, and the attention that is so vital for maintaining the sorts of connections that are protected for loneliness?
Yes, I love this question because I clearly see how it is confounding so many folks in Congress to try to figure out how to make these steps. And I can't not point out, since we started talking about the inauguration, I just have to point out the people who were sitting behind President Trump were not his cabinet members. Immediately behind, it was some of the most powerful men, billionaires who control a lot of what grabs our attention, right? And so that is a problem, because we need to know that whether it's the administration, whether it is Congress, whether it's the courts, that folks are putting the interests of regular people ahead of the interests of Meta, right? Or whether it is X or whatever it might be. And so I love that you said, I saw that piece by Ezra Klein as well about attention. I actually was talking about this morning in caucus to the person sitting next to me, that I am so focused on the phrase paying attention, that we only have a finite amount of attention. And every time we pay that to something, is it worthy of our attention? Is it giving back to us, or actually is just a way of extracting value for a company or an advertiser? And so this is something that there is work that can be done on antitrust in this space. I serve on the antitrust committee within the judiciary. But I do think the more salient way to get at this is to focus on health and safety, frankly. And you said something, so the algorithms. Here's what I've been pondering. We might pursue, and I don't even know if this is possible, but like thinking about looking at the Federal Elections Commission and seeing the algorithms as an in-kind donation to political campaigns. Because that's what it is.
Yeah, interesting.
You're driving people's attention. I haven't had a chance to talk to my team about this, but it was like all of a sudden yesterday, I was like, wait a minute. There is value that is being extracted through those algorithms. And let's name it. We're in America. Let's monetize it. Let's figure out what that means and like be serious about the fact that we are paying the price, literally, financially, but also with our attention and with our emotional health, I think.
It's interesting that you're focused on paying attention. I couldn't agree more. And one of the people that has significantly influenced me is Robert Bellah. And in his book, The Good Society, which I think he wrote in the early 90s, the last chapter is titled Democracy Means Paying Attention. And then he has another essay which is on care and care in America and how care, we talk about the care crisis.
Yeah.
The care crisis is absolutely related to the crisis of paying attention or what we're paying attention to, because care demands attention. It demands intense attention to do it well. So, one of the things you pointed out that in our survey of American loneliness that we funded the Harvard Making Caring Common project to do, they found that younger cohorts, Gen Z and millennials, are more lonely than I think any of us anticipated. And Gen Z 2023, based on our data, was the first year that the majority of first-time births in the United States were to Gen Z parents born since January 1st, 1997. And of course, we know that our millennials are the ones who are actively parenting. So when we think about loneliness, disconnection, anxiety, and depression, there's little societal support for the greatest stressors that parents of young children face. Quality childcare.
Yes.
They're overworked. They're working 3 jobs. They're struggling to pay childcare. They're struggling to keep up. So can you just talk about nurturing and deep connections in the early years for parents with young children as foundational to child development? And then what more we can be doing to support these parents of young children who really are anxious across the country?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, so much to unpack there. So I just want to start by saying what you said really resonated with me because I had this very powerful meeting with high school students last year. It was just a listening session, what's going on for you? And they said that we are addicted to our phones. We feel disconnected. We don't like it. We're anxious. We are being mined for data and we don't know what to do about it. And we don't know how adults are going to help us with this. Okay. So I want to just bring it back to what you were saying before. And then I have been leading on issues around childcare, paid family leave, sick leave, all of these things that make parents and families feel able to continue to participate in both the work world and the democracy itself. This I hear from people all the time. I would love to be able to volunteer. I mean, I always say Vermont's held together with duct tape twine and hundreds of volunteer hours, right, from community members. You don't feel part of your community if you have no time left over to engage on anything that is happening locally. So people feel further division. But we have to get to a place where we see these kinds of supports as part of the economy. Because what talks in America, right? Money talks, right? So, okay, let's look at it from a financial point of view. What is happening to families, companies, organizations when people do not have those supports that they need? They're coming to work sick. They are coming to work depressed, lonely, disconnected, or maybe they don't even feel like they can get back in the workforce because they don't have those supports. And I just want to speak from my own experience too, that I was very fortunate. Like I had a spouse that made enough money so that I could be home, which is so unusual. So unusual in this country, specifically in Vermont. Very, very difficult. Even given the supports that I had financially, I was still someone who felt incredibly lonely, anxious, disconnected, and depressed because I felt like I had just gone from being a part of the community to being in this tiny little micro unit.
Absolutely.
Right? And I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed that I felt that way. And I did not know how to build those connections. And so some of it is about, as you know, it's always like the first step is acknowledging you have a problem. Like the first step for this nation is, acknowledging we have a problem. But we also have to be better on my side of the aisle of finding those partners across the aisle who will help us pass paid family leave, that will help us pass things like housing support so people aren't spending so much of their income and so many hours working and they feel even more disconnected.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned that because we also did a study last year, national study of stay-at-home parents. And they're far more diverse and they're also lonely and anxious, but they're also far less financially secure than we would have imagined. And there's a lot we can do. For example, they're not included in the child independent care tax credit. So, there's some relatively small things we think we could do to make sure that stay-at-home parents are well supported. I just want to ask you, if I can, two last questions. And the first is, in the Combating Loneliness Act, you have investments in physical infrastructure. I'd love to just hear from you. What do you see as the connection between physical infrastructure and our social infrastructure, our social connections?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because, look, it is sometimes difficult for people to meet people, first of all, right, outside of their little circles, to build into meaningful connections. And we have to invest in places where those kinds of connections can happen. So looking at playgrounds, community gardens, recreation areas, bike paths, making sure our libraries have the supports they need to make programming that really brings people together in a meaningful way. And I think sometimes we have this sense in this country that we are all rugged individuals. Like that is part of the American psyche, right? That we ought to be able to do it ourselves. And I think sometimes that really gets in the way of acknowledging that we actually can grease the skids on some of these things with not that much money and creating these third spaces for people to gather. But it's a way to also say, it's not you, right? It's not particular to you. We have a crisis. So obviously there's things about the physical infrastructure and the systems that are making it more difficult for millions and millions of people, right? To take it away from the individual, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm lonely because I'm bad at making friends. I'm lonely because, right? Oftentimes that is our default. And I would like to sort of normalize the experience, saying you're not alone with this, right? And there is so much relief that comes from feeling not alone in something. And so for us to use our dollars to invest in structures that can assist in making those connections, I think is really valuable and critical.
Thank you. Thank you for that. My last question is always some version of what's a project you've dreamed about but haven't started yet. And so that could be a piece of legislation. It could also be a personal project, something you want to do in retirement.
Wow. I am one of those people that has a million ideas. So I'll settle on one that I have talked about a lot with my team in Vermont. I want to create more dynamic gatherings of voters, constituents that are not about policy. It's not about me at a town hall, talking about Social Security, Medicare, though those are incredibly important things. I want to create meaningful gatherings where people can feel joyful and connected. And we've been talking about this in earnest on the last 2 years. And it's difficult because, we've had a lot of just needing to put out fires. We had 2 years of terrible flooding in Vermont. And so that has drawn a lot of our attention. But I know that project will have so many ripple effects that I will never see, but I know will be positive. And I am committed to getting back to a time when we saw each other as Vermonters first, political party, a distant 10th, hopefully, right? Like that is not the first thing. We are Vermonters. We are community members. Let's check the political stuff at the door. We're just here to be together in community. I want to model that for people. So I hope I'm able to pull that together.
Thank you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Great conversation. I really appreciate it. And again, I really appreciate the great work you're all doing. It really matters. And I'm going to go back and read that other study you referenced.
Great.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Thank you so
Hope
much.
to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.